They would remember that final standoff for years to come, the swirl of dust in the dying sun, the thunderous crack of gunfire echoing across the desert, and the look in the Apache warrior's eyes, equal parts rage and resignation. At the center of it all stood one lone rancher, heart pounding like the hooves of frightened mustangs, torn between his duty to protect what was his and the haunting knowledge that a single wrong decision would turn every last drop of blood to dust beneath the Arizona sky. They would never forget the moment he raised his hand in either an act of salvation or the final spark that would set the prairie ablaze. Arizona Territory, 1882. A scorching sun dominated the wide, endless sky, the land below baked to shades of ochre and umber. Heat shimmered off the desert floor, and the horizon stretched so far that the line between earth and sky seemed a distant rumor. Pockets of mesquite and the occasional saguaro cactus broke up plains of sandy grit, while red mesas stood guard in the distance, towering walls of silent rock that spoke of centuries gone by. Dust devils spiraled lazily across an otherwise lifeless expanse, giving the land an unearthly, rugged beauty. Under that blistering sun stood the Bar-El Ranch, an outpost of rough-hewn planks and battered fences, perched near a sporadic creek, one of the few water sources for miles. Jack was a tall man of 35, with rough stubble on his face and deep, set gray eyes that carried the weight of countless hardships. A single streak of white cut through his hair on the left side of his head, a remnant of an old injury, or perhaps the stress carried by a man who tried to hold a family's legacy together with bare hands. Jack had come west with his late father a decade earlier, dreaming of fertile grazing lands and a new start. But by the time the old man passed, the Arizona sun and the frontier's harsh realities had burned those early dreams to ash. Still, Jack clung to the ranch, determined to build something lasting, something honorable. Jack's goal was simple yet all-consuming: to keep the Bar-El Ranch solvent and safe, providing a future for himself and, he hoped, a family one day. His fear was equally straightforward: losing everything and watching the land he'd spilled sweat and blood for slip through his fingers, especially if the simmering conflicts with local Apache bands escalated. On his worst nights, he saw images of flames swallowing the ranch or horsemen thundering in under the cover of darkness, forcing him to flee like a penniless vagabond. It was this dread that drove him awake before dawn, day after day, to check the fences, tend to the cattle, and keep an ear to the ground for rumors of unrest. Lean like a steel blade and equally sharp, Nanton was half Apache, half Mexican, and belonged fully to neither world. His Apache mother had died giving birth, and his father, an itinerant Mexican horse trader, had vanished one day, leaving no trace behind. Nanton grew up pulled between two identities, never fully welcome in either. He'd learned to track game before he could speak properly, and in his teen years he found fleeting acceptance among a small Apache band near the mountains. He spent his early adulthood drifting between frontier towns, revered for his skill with horses but distrusted for his heritage. Nanton's goal was to find a place to belong, a spot of earth where he could plant roots without feeling hunted or resented. His fear was that he'd always remain an outcast, perpetually suspect, forever caught in the crossfire of two cultures that refused to claim him. Even so, he carried himself with quiet dignity, and there was a kindness in his dark eyes that sometimes seemed out of place in the ruthless frontier. A hot wind swept across Bar-El Ranch as Jack stood on the porch, reading a telegram for the third time. His mouth pressed into a thin line, and the paper trembled slightly in his calloused hand. It was from a distant contact in Santa Fe, warning of rising tensions with the Apache in southern Arizona. Murmurs of a splinter group outraged by new territorial encroachments. Jack could almost hear the creeping hooves of trouble heading his way. "Not on my land," he muttered to himself, crushing the telegram into a crumpled ball. He walked down the steps, boots kicking up small clouds of dust. With each step, his mind replayed the memory of a conversation he once had with a neighboring rancher who had insisted that any peace with the Apache was fleeting, just a lull before violence. Jack had seen enough to know better than to fully believe or dismiss such talk, but caution was a necessity out here. He'd only just reached the corral when he heard hoofbeats. A single rider approaching, slow but deliberate. Jack shielded his eyes from the glare and spotted Nanton for the first time, leading a tired mustang that looked as though it had galloped through a war zone. Nanton pulled up short, dust settling around him like a shroud. He met Jack's gaze, searching for animosity, or maybe a welcome, in those gray eyes. The unspoken tension hung in the air. "Water?" Nanton asked softly. His tone was neither pleading nor rude, simply factual. He needed water for his horse, and possibly for himself. Jack nodded. "Help yourself over at the trough. It ain't much, but it's cleaned." Nanton dismounted, leading the horse by the reins. The animal's sides were streaked with sweat, its head drooping in exhaustion. Nanton moved with a purposeful grace, checking the horse's hooves, brushing dust from its mane, before finally letting it drink. Jack watched in silence, noticing how the stranger tended to the horse first, only afterward scooping water in his hands to drink. Compassion for animals was a sign of good character in Jack's book, or at least, it often was. "Name's Jack Greeley," he called out, extending a hand. Nanton looked from Jack's face to his outstretched hand. He set down the tin cup of water he'd just filled. "Nanton Laredo." He accepted the handshake, a firm but not crushing grip. Jack raised an eyebrow. "Laredo, but you've got the look of—" He trailed off, unsure if he should say it. "I am who I am," Nanton said quietly. "Apache, Mexican. Some days I feel like neither." He gave a small shrug and returned to his horse. The sun glared overhead, and in that light, they could both feel the presence of a deep chasm. Between them, between their worlds, and in the uncertain future the territory faced. Care for a meal. Jack offered, not sure what prompted him to extend such kindness. "I've got some beans and jerky in the house." Nanton studied him, then nodded. "It's been a while since I ate a proper meal, if that can be called proper." Jack's lips twitched into something resembling a smile. "Well, out here proper is a matter of perspective." Together they walked toward the ramshackle ranch house. Neither knew then that their fates would soon collide more violently than two bulls in a dusty corral, nor that their meeting would stand at the crossroads of the Apache's fury and a rancher's unyielding resolve. The night sky over Bar El Ranch was inky black, the heavens dusted with stars so bright they seemed close enough to pluck like fruit. A whisper of a breeze brought some relief from the day's lingering heat. Jack found Nanton perched on the ranch's short porch, gazing out into the darkness, his arms resting on his knees. "Figured I'd catch you before you turned in," Jack said, stepping outside with 2 tin cups of coffee. Nanton accepted the cup in silence, nodding his thanks. They sipped for a time, listening to cicadas chirping, the distant lowing of cattle, and the occasional rustle of wind through desert brush. It was a rare moment of tranquility, a lull in a land that knew only struggle. "I heard there's trouble brewing," Nanton said at length. "Apache groups near the southern boundary. Raiders on horseback." Jack glanced at him. "How do you know?" Nanton's dark eyes flickered. "I passed through a settlement 2 days west of here, a stagecoach way station. People were in a panic. They say a breakaway band has moved up from the Sierra Madre." Jack nodded. "Yeah, got the news from a friend in Santa Fe. Seems they're stirred up by the influx of ranchers, cavalry outposts, and the railroad pushing deeper. Can't blame them for being mad. But you also can't let them burn your ranch," Nanton said quietly. Jack sighed, his gaze drifting across the ranch yard. "No, I can't. But I also don't want war. There's been enough blood spilled." Nanton finished his coffee and set the cup aside. "I was going to cross the creek tomorrow, head further west. But I could stick around for a while if you need a hand. I know horses, can do ranch work if it'll pay for some grub." Jack studied the man's face. There was sincerity there, maybe even a hint of desperation. In truth, Jack could use a hand. He had help from a part-time wrangler named Amos and a ranch cook, but the ranch was sprawling, and there was always more work than daylight. "Sir," Jack finally said, "let's see how it goes. You stay a while, earn a meal and a bed." That night, Jack lay awake on his narrow bed, a loaded revolver on the table near his pillow. At some point, he drifted into nightmares. He saw flames licking at the ranch house timbers, heard horses screaming, and felt the ground shake from galloping hooves. Through the haze, an Apache warrior loomed, face contorted in fury. Yet right before the dream ended, that warrior's features shifted and resembled Nanton's. Jack woke in a cold sweat, heart pounding. 2 weeks later, dawn had barely broken when Jack found Nanton in the corral, facing a raw-boned stallion that was all muscle and pent-up rage. The beast was a wild mustang they'd managed to capture during a roundup, and Jack had insisted no one try to break it alone. Yet here was Nanton, rope in hand, calm as the morning breeze. "Easy, boy," Nanton whispered, inching closer. The horse pawed at the ground, ears pinned back. Its eyes rolled white, and hot breath puffed into the cool air. At the corral fence, Jack tensed, ready to jump in if things turned ugly. Amos stood beside him, gripping the rails, shaking his head. "He'll get himself killed." Jack's lips parted, but he found no words. Part of him was amazed by the quiet confidence emanating from Nanton. The other part was anxious. The ranch couldn't afford to lose a man, especially not to a foolhardy display of bravado. Nanton raised a hand, letting the horse see it. Slowly, he moved his arm in small, sweeping motions as though painting strokes in the air. The horse snorted, uncertain, but did not rear. Step by step, Nanton approached, speaking soft words in a language Jack couldn't identify. Maybe Spanish, maybe Apache, maybe a blend of both. After a tense minute, the horse lowered its head. In a deft motion, Nanton looped the rope around the horse's neck, sliding it gently as though it were a warm blanket instead of a restraint. The horse jerked once, but Nanton moved with it, a fluid dance of muscle and reflex. Then, as if by miracle, the horse calmed. Amos let out a breath he'd been holding. "Well, I'll be damned. He's a whisper?" Jack pushed off the fence and entered the corral. The newly lassoed horse looked at him, ears twitching, but remained relatively still while Nanton made small, soothing sounds. "You're quite good at this," Jack said, a cautious smile tugging at his lips. Nanton shrugged, wiping sweat from his brow. "I've always had a way with horses. Been doing it my whole life." Jack nodded. "We can use your skill. Might round up more wild mustangs, break them, and sell them at a good price. Cavalry's always looking for fresh mounts." Nanton's eyes flickered. The cavalry. He let the thought trail off. Jack felt a prick of guilt. He knew the cavalry had clashed with Apache bands time and again. Some engagements downright massacres, but business was business, and the ranch needed income. "Let's see what we can do," Jack said, trying to lighten his tone. "You'd get a fair cut of the profits if you help me break them." Nanton nodded. "I'd appreciate that." Jack placed a hand on Nanton's shoulder, a gesture of trust. "We've got bigger problems, though. Word is that a small group of warriors has been spotted not far from here. Neighbors are on edge." Nanton looked away, jaw tightening. "If it's who I think it is, there's a man named Cacique leading them. He's full of anger, lost most of his family to cavalry raids. He doesn't trust any settler. Is he likely to come here?" Jack asked. "Could be," Nanton said grimly. "Or they might pass by if they think it's not worth the trouble. Hard to say." They locked eyes, and in that instant, a silent pact formed. They would try to keep trouble at bay. But even as they shared that unspoken understanding, a wind whipped through the corral, sending a spiral of dust between them, as if the desert itself prophesied the storm to come. A month later, the situation grew more fraught. A traveling peddler arrived one afternoon with word that a ranch to the south had been hit, cattle stolen, 2 hired hands injured, 1 missing. The culprits were rumored to be Apache warriors, though the details were murky. The peddler's eyes darted nervously at the sight of Nanton, but Jack insisted on feeding the man, paying him for what meager supplies he could spare, and sending him on his way. That evening, A thundercloud built up on the horizon, lightning dancing within its black belly. The thunderhead reflected the mood of everyone at the Bar L. They bunkered in the barn, reinforcing doors, securing livestock, and loading rifles. Hours passed, and the storm arrived in full fury after midnight. Driving rain turned the dry creek into a raging torrent. Lightning illuminated the ranch house as if ignited in ghostly flames, and thunder shook the windows. Jack Amos and Nanton worked side by side, battling the wind and deluge to keep the fences from collapsing. The cattle lowed in panic, pressed tight against the barn walls. Rain stung like needles on bare skin, and each lightning strike threatened to stampede the herd. In that roaring chaos, Nanton's voice rose above the storm, calling to the animals in a language of calm commands. His presence guided them away from the open desert, preventing them from scattering into the night. By dawn, the storm had passed, leaving destruction in its wake: broken fences, scattered hay, and a battered barn roof. Exhaustion weighed heavy on every man's shoulders. As they began repairs, Jack spoke to Nanton in hushed tones. "We got off easy this time, but if that Apache band decides to strike when we're this vulnerable..." Nanton nodded, too drained to say much, but a new resolve burned in his eyes. He understood the precariousness. His heart lay torn. He empathized with Apache grievances, but Jack's fairness, his willingness to offer shelter and work, had forged a bond that Nanton couldn't ignore. Later that same day, just as they began to see the ranch coming back to order, a single rider appeared on the horizon. Jack stood at the porch, a rifle across his arms, while Nanton and Amos took positions at the side of the yard. The rider approached at a slow gait, eventually drawing close enough for them to see he was Mexican, wearing a worn sombrero and a bright sash. He halted a dozen yards away, hands raised. "You Jack Greeley?" He called in Spanish, tinged English. Jack nodded. "I am. What's your business?" The stranger licked his lips, eyeing the rifle warily. "I come with a message from Cacique. He knows the half-breed is here, says that if the rancher values his life and property, he will send him away. They do not trust him, and they do not trust you." Jack exchanged a glance with Nanton, who stood frozen, fists clenched. Anger and shame warred in his face. Jack turned back to the rider. "Tell Cacique that Nanton is free to come and go as he pleases. He's not a prisoner, and I won't force him out." The rider spat on the ground. "Then watch your backs." He turned his horse around and galloped off. The cloud of dust slowly settled, leaving silence that rang loud in everyone's ears. Amos cursed under his breath, and Nanton looked at Jack with haunted eyes. "If I stay, I bring danger." Jack's jaw worked as though trying to crush an unspoken worry. Finally, he spoke. "Maybe so. But if you leave, trouble might still come, and we lose the best damn ranch hand I've ever had. Your call, though. I won't chain you here." Nanton's expression hardened with resolve. "I'll stay. You treated me like a man, not a dog. Cacique has to learn we're not all enemies." The words hung in the hot desert air, as if daring fate to prove them wrong. 2 weeks later, the afternoon sun burned mercilessly, the sky a piercing blue dome without a single cloud. Jack stood near the corral, scanning the horizon, anticipating the worst. And the worst arrived as a faint speck on the desert floor, soon multiplying into 4 or 5 specks. A party of Apache warriors rode closer, their horses kicking up dust. At the head, a lean, scarred man with fierce eyes, Cacique. Jack swallowed hard, shouldering his rifle. Amos and another ranch hand, Todd, flanked him. Nanton took up a spot just behind Jack, unarmed by choice, a sign of goodwill, though he carried a hunting knife strapped to his thigh. The riders came to a halt a stone's throw from the ranch house. Cacique's eyes flicked from Jack to Amos to Todd, then settled with burning intensity on Nanton. He spoke in Apache, his tone full of scorn. Nanton responded calmly, his voice measured. Jack caught only fragments, words about peace, about fairness, but Cacique roared, shaking his head, spittle flying. Then the guns came out. 2 of Cacique's men brandishing rifles with the desperation of cornered wolves. The tension snapped taut. Jack's breath caught in his throat. If they opened fire, blood would flow. In that split second, Nanton stepped forward, arms raised. "No," he shouted in English, turning to Jack. "Put your weapon down." Jack hesitated, every survival instinct screaming at him not to relinquish his advantage. But something in Nanton's gaze demanded trust. Slowly, Jack lowered his rifle, letting it rest first on the ground, muzzle pointed to the sky. Amos cursed under his breath but followed suit, though his eyes never left the Apache warriors. Cacique watched in disbelief. Nanton spoke again in Apache. His voice rose and fell with impassioned urgency. He spoke of the times he had been spurned, of the cruelty he'd witnessed, but also of the kindness Jack had shown him. He told them how he had found a place to belong, how war would only lead to more vengeance and more loss. Cacique's face darkened, his jaw tensing. A flash of heartbreak, or perhaps bitter memory, crossed his features. He raised his rifle, pointing it directly at Nanton. Silence fell like an anvil onto the desert. Time seemed to crystallize. Jack's heart hammered, he debated lunging for his gun. But one false move and all was lost. Nanton stood unflinching, arms still wide, chest exposed, daring Cacique to pull the trigger. For a breathless moment it seemed certain that Cacique would fire. Instead, he lowered the rifle, eyes brimming with hot tears that he blinked away in anger. With a dismissive snarl, he pulled on his horse's reins and turned, spurring the beast into a gallop. The other Apache warriors lingered only an instant, exchanging unreadable looks with Nanton, then followed their leader. Dust swallowed them up, and they were gone. The ranch yard was deathly still but for the ragged breathing of men who just stared mortality in the face. Amos exhaled shakily. Todd swore he needed whiskey. Nanton's arms slowly dropped, relief and exhaustion radiating from him like heat waves off sun-scorched rock. Jack approached, laying a trembling hand on Nanton's shoulder. "You saved us," he said, voice catching. Nanton shook his head. "Not sure. They might still come back." Jack nodded. "Maybe. But for now, we live." Days passed without incident. Cautiously, life returned to a semblance of normal. Jack discovered that a local buyer was interested in purchasing horses, and he and Nanton worked from dawn to dusk rounding up mustangs. A letter arrived with news that the cavalry had engaged another Apache band several counties away, further escalating tensions. Yet Cacique's group never returned to Bar El as if a silent truce had been granted. Uneasy but real enough. One blazing afternoon, Jack found Nanton loading supplies into saddlebags. "You going somewhere?" Nanton nodded, eyes searching the distant horizon. "I have to try and talk sense to others out there. Apache half-breeds, anyone stuck between two worlds. I want them to know there's another way. That not all white men or settlers are the enemy." Jack swallowed, a pang of sadness ripping through him. He'd grown to rely on Nanton's friendship, and on some level, he understood they each had their own journeys. "You sure you want to go?" Nanton's smile was gentle. "It's time. I'll come back if fate allows. I'm grateful to you, Jack, for showing me a piece of kindness in a ruthless land." With a parting handshake that spoke volumes, of respect, of unity forged in fire, Nanton mounted the horse he'd tamed and rode off into the shimmering heat. Jack watched until he disappeared into the desert, a lone figure merging with the waves of sunlight. Out on the frontier, every conflict can become a crucible that tests not just a man's resolve but the very substance of his soul. Sometimes, the bravest act is not to draw a weapon but to lay it down, trusting in the fragile bond between two souls caught in the winds of change. The land scorches, storms rage, and hearts remain divided by suspicion. But in the silent moments, compassion can break through like green shoots after a desert rain. No matter how wide the desert stretches or how harsh the sun beats down, there is always room for mercy, for understanding, and for the courage to seek a path that doesn't end in bloodshed. Thank you for joining this journey across the Arizona plains. If this story moved you, please like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice keeps these frontiers alive. Safe travels, friend.